Hi, it's Krista from Island Sewing Center in Campbell River. Today we're back, and we're back to talk about something very important to anyone who sews and especially anyone who does machine embroidery, and that is wrinkles. We're going to talk about wrinkles. I have two samples here. This one that I've put on with on the scanning mat for the Brother Dream Machine and the Luminaire, and then this one which is still inside of the hoop. What I want to talk about today is actually begin with this sample and end with this sample and show you ways to fix things, sort of troubleshoot, and what not to do more than anything else. Okay, so Peter has zoomed in, and hopefully you can clearly see my little mess of a sample here. It's not very pretty. Let me just put it out there right away. Why is it not pretty? Well, first of all, I'm using a tearaway stabilizer, which I have hooped in the embroidery frame on its own. Then I have done a thing called floating, which is where you just lay your fabric on top and you start stitching away. You notice that there are creases and pretty bad rimples and dimples. That's from the push-pull compensation, yanking this fabric back and forth as this little bunny stitches out. You'll also notice that because it was not properly hooped and not properly reinforced, that we have some pretty bad distortion. And the distortion is down here. There's quite a big void right here. At this other foot is quite a big void. You can see at the top of the bunny's ear, this line is too far away from the stitching, just like it is here. And there are some parts, if you can look close enough, you'll see that it actually goes right on top of the embroidery instead of stitching around it. We don't want that. What we want is something that is crisp and clean. So then in the second sample, what I've done is I've done what's called an outline stitch or a tack stitch. Sorry about that. An outline stitch or a tack stitch, tack down stitch, or some people call it a knockdown stitch. And it's just big honkin' cow stitches that goes around the perimeter, the exterior of your embroidery design. This is not brand specific. All high-end embroidery machines have this ability. This is still floating, and I still have a tearaway stabilizer behind it. What I did differently was I starched the living bejumpins out of this fabric to make it good and stiff. Then I tacked it down, and then I did my stitching. Now, it's still not perfect. There's still a little bit of distortion right here at this foot, but the rest of it is pretty darn good. And I would be quite happy with that, except for this. So then what do we do to fix these oopses? That's what I want to talk about. Just to have a real close-up and a second look at what we have here in front of us, which I see quite often. It's a newbie thing, but it's still salvageable. It's not necessarily garbage, okay? And I want to show you how to fix it. So you have an unironed piece of fabric to begin with. It is unsupported on top of that. And because of that, fabric has a four-way stretch. It has a tendency to pull in this direction and this direction, but worst of all, in the bias. It pulls in the bias like that. So you can actually see these little puckers. That's where the fold was, but you can see these little puckers, and they're increasing worse and sort of coming out, radiating out worse where it is on the bias. And I just wanted to show you that. And it isn't necessarily the stabilizer, although I don't use tearaway all the time for all things. I would have used a cutaway in this case because it supports the bunny after the fact through laundering and through sewing and through use. But in this case I used a tearaway because it's an example of how a tearaway behaves as well. So there you have the bunny that way. Now I'm going to bring the second bunny in. See if I can lay it kind of on top of where the other bunny was. Whoopsie. And I can point out that with the tack down stitch, which is just great big cow stitches, my mom used to call them cow stitches, great big cow stitches that secure this fabric. This fabric is nice and stiff. It's been ironed, it's been steamed, and then it's been starched. So there is less movement. There is still some movement. Sorry, that's my iron. There is still some movement going. You can see it right here, there's a little bit. But for the most part, except right here, you have these stitches falling right close in line, and the push-pull compensation on the bias, again, in particular, has not adversely affected this design. A little bit here, but compared to the other bunny, let me just pull this one out of the way, do you see the difference? I mean, it's pretty glaring. Okay, so now let's fix it. The first thing we need to deal with, the very first thing we need to deal with, is all of this stuff, because there's no way that I can deal with the fabric as a piece with all of this this tearaway stabilizer on it. So I'm just going to flip this upside down, and we're going to start, and this is where you get all your aggressions out, by tearing the stabilizer away. Okay? That is now gone. And clean it up as best as you can. I would clean these little nasty bits too, but we're not going to worry about that today. So now I have my original bunny with no all of that stabilizer is gone. So what are we going to do? The first thing we're going to do is put a nice clean, and I like white. White shows any bleeding. So if this is a black fabric, if I have bleeding going off of this fabric, which coincidentally is not washed, then it's going to show. So I'm going to hit it with a little bit of water just in the corner, and then I'm going to hit it with a hot iron to test. Hope you can see that. Forward. Better? There you go. Peter is directing me as we go here. So I'm testing to see if once this is wet, am I going to get a color impression on my white. That's why I like the white. Okay, so I know that I can now absolutely torture this fabric. And what we want to do is, wrong way, sorry. What we want to do is we want to be able to get this, all of this backing thread or bobbin thread to become very, very loosey-goosey, okay? So Peter tells me I'm in shot, so what I have in front of me is a little dollar store bottle. Inside of it is distilled water, and I've actually marked it distilled water. I like distilled water in this case because distilled water has a tendency to not have any iron or anything in it, and so then it's a clean water, which we have added about a capful of vinegar on it. What vinegar does is vinegar will loosen things up a little bit better. And I'm going to get really, 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 really aggressive and absolutely saturate the back of my bunny. Now this looks like overkill. I'm going to let it sit for a second. Smells like French fries actually. And you can see what's really glaring is now all of this distortion is really popped up. Can you see that? And that is because this bobbin thread has loosened up. It's become saturated with water, so it's loosened. Now I don't like to iron on my bobbin thread, so what I have here, and I'll just bring it into screen, is just a little bucket, and it's a tea towel that is clean, by the way, and it has some warm water in it, just warm water, and it's also soaking wet. You can hear that, okay? So I'm going to lay that as a press cloth on top of my bunny. There you go. I also have an iron set to maximum, and I do not have the steam buttons on. Can you see that? They are disengaged. We don't want steam at this point, but it has to be hot, and I'm pressing down. Now, what's happening in the background is that this fabric, it wants to go back to the way that it originally was manufactured with the warp and the weft. So what I'm doing with the absolute soaking of this fabric, and then actually steam pressing it, I guess would be the word, with a wet press cloth, and I'm just moving a hot iron back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to steam that. Now, I am not going to move my object, I'm just going to pull it up. Okay, there is still, whoo, look at all that steam. There is still issues here, but I already see a great improvement here, okay? So now we have everything soaking wet. I'm just going to flip it over. Look at that, we do have color on my, do you see that? I also have an impression of my bunny on there. I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen for a second. So now I'm going to put steam on my iron, and I'm going to iron and pull. Can you hear my iron steaming away? And iron and pull. And I'm going in with the point towards the stretch area, and I'm pulling the fabric to where it needs to go. And I'll just keep going and keep going. It takes time and it takes patience. I'm going to turn the steam off for a second. Woo! Okay, let's move this over and get a clean white surface again. So we still have some problems. We still have, it's still not perfect, and you know what? It is never going to be. It just is not, you're never going to get it as good as if it were properly stabilized. Now I have a dry iron, and I'm going over it roughly. I'm being very unkind to this bunny, because what I want to do is I want this fabric as much as possible to release itself from underneath that bottom thread. I'll just do half of them for now so you can kind of get the idea of what it is that I'm looking for. All right, can you see that? Am I okay in the shot there? Okay, so you can see there's still some distortion here, but compared to how it was before, there's a vast improvement. So then the next question comes. I would continue on with this. I would just keep working it and working it until it was as good as it's going to get. I noticed that this side of it is a lot straighter than it was originally. This side is still pretty warped in, but okay, so we got half a bunny, pretty good. What do you do with this part of it here? Well, it's already kind of improved around the ear just by my pulling it a little bit. But what you do is you go to a place like, I don't know, dollar store, Staples, Walmart, wherever you go shopping for Sharpie markers, and you buy them in every color that comes available. And you take, in this case it would be either blue or pink, and you would color in those voids, and then once you set it with an iron, you heat set it, so you would lay it backwards and you would heat set it with the iron. It becomes permanent. So is it perfect? No, absolutely not. It's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than it used to be, and you can fix it. So then the lesson is, don't do this. I know that sounds mean, but honestly, don't just float and not prep your fabric. So let's now just breathe for a second after that. I'm going to pull in the second one sample, which was pretty well hooped, using the same tearaway stabilizer, but you'll see the difference here, okay? Just one sec. Okay, so here is our bunny that we've just messed with. It's dry on this side, but it's still a little bit damp on that side, okay? I just want you to have a quick look at this one. I'm just going to slide it aside, and you can see the difference. Let me just put them side by side. If you're comparing, whoops, half of a bunny here and half of a bunny there, it's pretty darn good, but it's not perfect. By the way, I just want to point out, I used you wouldn't do this. I used a light colored thread so that you could see it here, and then I used a dark colored thread, which normally would be black, so you can again see it. Okay, it's just for visibility. So a little trick is when you're doing your tack down stitch or your basting stitch or this big honkin' stitch here, hold on to the top thread, just the top thread, and make a long tail on it. You see how long a tail I have on there? Because the machine will go 1, 2, 3 and then move over, and what tends to happen is that because the stitches are so big that when it jumps over it pulls this top thread out of the bobbin thread. So if you're hanging on to this, it's got a sporting chance of making it around the perimeter of your embroidery design perfectly. Okay, so that's a little tip, because I know a lot of people struggle with that. Now I'm going to take this out of the hoop, and you do that by simply popping it out. And by the way, with these hoops, I'll just bring this one up a little bit. Hopefully I'm in shot. With these hoops, if you're using the same stabilizer over and over again, or the same fabric and batting and stabilizer over and over again, once you have it set for one, you should be able to do a repeat, 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 repeat. Okay? And not adjust, you won't have to adjust the, how am I setting there? Girl, I'm asking Peter. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to flip it over. And this time I'm going to get rid of these anchoring stitches. Oops, with a pair of scissors. And pull out the thread. And I do this before I take the tearaway stabilizer out, because you want to get as close to the actual embroidery design as you physically can. Okay, and same thing, oops, one little rogue. There's always one. All right, same thing, we're just going to tear it away and clean it up a little bit. Okay, there you go. Now, because, let me flip you around, oops. Because I have, sorry about that, a little bit of distortion down here at the bottom of his foot, just a little bit. It's not, you know what, it's not bad. But now that I've released him from his tension, you can see that it's pulling in a bit. I'm going to do the same thing. And what I'm going to do is to flip him upside down so that I have my bobbin thread facing me. I would clean all of this up first. Take my distilled water, okay, with a cap full of vinegar. If you don't happen to have any vinegar, rubbing alcohol works okay too. Tends to get in there and just loosen things up. But I like vinegar. It smells like French fries. It smells really, really good. I like French fries. Okay, some wet tea towel and a hot iron, and it is on maximum. You can hear that. Now I'm hoping this time I don't get any bleeding of the, like I did with the black. That was quite shocking actually. Even though I did a test, it still went through. Woo. But I noticed that it didn't go through the thread at all. It just went onto the towel, which is fine. And that's the vinegar. The vinegar does that. Alright, so now I've got a soaking wet little bunny. Eesh. And I can see there's a little bit that I want to deal with here. I'm not going to put any steam on because he really doesn't need it, and I'm just going to clean him up. Now this bunny, I've used this bunny for so many samples because the push-pull on him is pretty nasty. It's a built-in design. Not all built-in designs are worth their salt, but then not all purchase designs are either. So now what I'm doing is I'm actually ironing him dry. I'm very happy with the end result. And I'm sure you can see the steam coming up. These reliable irons are amazing. They're so good. They're so worth the money. And the steam on them, the first setting is a little bit. That's the one I use the most, but this one just gives like a sauna of steam. Okay, so once he's dry, which he's not yet, he's pretty wet, right? Oopsie. How did that happen? Come on, you. Behave. Go in there. Sorry. What happens when you lay them on their tummies and you actually push him into the towel is that it becomes three-dimensional. You're pushing the embroidery design down, and when that happens, it pops to the front in a 3D way. It's the coolest effect. really like it on a quilt in particular, or for me, wall hangings. I do a lot of wall hangings. Okay, and again, I would spend a little bit more time, but he's okay. So then you notice how 3D he is. Can you see how he's kind of popped up? He's really popped forward, and that's because this outline stitch is properly placed. It's right next to his little body. Whoops, sorry. It's right next to his little body, so then it allows that to pop forward, which is a really cool effect. So then when you're all done with it and you're happy with it and it's completely dry, what I do to set it is I use, we like Best Press. It's Mary Ellen's Best Press, but you don't have to use Best Press. You can use any kind of spray starch. And then what I do is, again, on the back, once it's 100% dry, I give it a good liberal spray starch, and that tends to set whatever your hard work was in place, okay? So it is all fixable. It is 3D'able. If I spent more time with this bunny, I could make him look not as good, but pretty close to that. You can see there's already a pretty good improvement in him. Okay, so there you go. I hope that helps. And wrinkles be gone. You didn't have to use any oil of Olay or anything like that to fix little bunny.